And let me go straight to Chicago, where Professor John Mearsheimer joins us. John Mearsheimer is a leading American international relations expert and professor of political science at the University of Chicago. And he has termed the Trump administration's India policy a colossal blunder and asserted that secondary tariffs on India for buying Russian oil won't work. Professor Mearsheimer, President Trump and his trade advisor have accused India for directly supporting Russia's geopolitical ambitions through its oil imports and have gone on to criticize Prime Minister Modi's cooperation with Putin and Xi Jinping at the SCO summit, calling it detrimental to US interests. How do these accusations, in fact, now fit into the ongoing trade talks between the two nations? And is Donald Trump jeopardizing 25-year-old carefully crafted relations between the two democracies, something that former NSA Jake Sullivan spoke about?
Well, I think there's no question that President Trump has done a great deal of damage to U.S.-Indian relations. What's quite paradoxical here is that in his first term as president, he did a lot to improve U.S.-Indian relations. And at the beginning of his second term earlier this year, when Prime Minister Modi visited the White House, it looked like U.S.-Indian relations were just going to get even better. But in recent months, what has happened is that President Trump has taken a number of measures that have basically sabotaged those relations, and the United States and India are at loggerheads today.
And Professor, the SCO summit at Tianjin emphasized enhanced regional security, economic integration, and cooperation as alternatives to Western-led global order. How does India's active participation in the SCO challenge the United States' leverage in trade talks? And to what extent do you see tariffs being used as a coercive tool in this larger strategic rivalry now?
Well, there's no question that tariffs are being used as a coercive tool. The reason that the Trump administration has slapped 50% tariffs on India is in large part due to the fact that the Indians are still trading with the Russians. They're importing Russian oil. And this makes the Trump administration very angry. It's important to understand that the Trump administration has no real leverage against Russia.
Okay.
And because the United States has been supporting Ukraine in that war, it will be a humiliating blow for the United States. And this is to say it'll be a humiliating blow for the Trump administration if Russia wins that war. So what the Trump administration is doing is desperately searching for some sort of instrument to put pressure on the Russians to get the Russians to compromise. And the only instrument they seem to think that they have available at this point in time is putting tariffs on India and getting India to break off its relations with the Russians. In other words, to stop importing Russian oil. But this is not going to work. All it's going to do is worsen relations between the United States and India. And this is certainly not in America's strategic interest. So what the Trump administration is trying to do to rescue the situation in Ukraine by punishing India is going to backfire. We're going to lose in Ukraine anyway. And furthermore, we're going to end up alienating India and pushing India closer to Russia. And we're going to end up pushing India closer to China. This is not in our strategic interest.
Yes.
And this is why what President Trump is doing is a colossal blunder.
Okay. Given the Trump administration's framing of the US-India trade relationship as a totally one-sided disaster, and Donald Trump himself took to Truth Social to say so, and the subsequent steep tariffs, to what extent do you see this economic conflict reflecting an underlying power struggle consistent with your own thesis that great powers seek to limit peer competitors' rise?
Well, I don't think the United States is interested in preventing the rise of India. In fact, I think the United States has a vested interest in seeing India grow more powerful, just like it has a vested interest in seeing good relations between the United States and India. And this is in large part due to the fact that the United States considers China to be its principal adversary, and it has a deep-seated interest in having a powerful India help to check China's ambitious agenda in Asia. So, from a strategic point of view, the United States has a powerful set of incentives to work with India to help make India more powerful. With regard to the economic relations, there's no question, I think most Indians recognize this, that there were economic problems that had to be fixed. And India was going to have to make some concessions. And people were talking about this in the spring and last winter of this year. So people recognize the economic problem that exists, the trade imbalance, for example, certain Indian tariffs that were bothering the Americans. But it looked like the Indians and the Americans were going to be able to work out a deal.
Okay.
These were not insurmountable problems. What I'm saying is that the economic problems, which were clearly there, were not insurmountable. But what happened is other political considerations got in the way, starting with Trump's claim that he settled the India-Pakistan conflict in the spring of this year, and then the whole issue of sanctions because India was continuing to import Russian oil. So that economic problem that could have been solved has not been solved, but not because of the economic problems per se, but because of subsequent political problems that arose.
Okay, Professor Mearsheimer, considering accusations that the US tariff policy under Trump was influenced by personal and political agendas, and as you said, the ceasefire claims by Donald Trump himself, how should, do you think it's domestic politics in great powers which actually tends to distort or complicate the power struggles and negotiations, especially in the context of what is an evolving situation, an evolving US-India trade deal, and particularly about the strategic relationship as well in the backdrop of the SCO summit?
Well, I actually don't see domestic politics mattering much in terms of US-India relations. I think most Americans have very positive attitudes towards Indians. Uh, there are lots of Indians who live in the United States who are on college campuses, and they're highly regarded, highly respected. So I don't see any domestic agenda at play here in the United States. I think one could argue that the economic problems that we discussed before mattered somewhat from a domestic point of view. But again, those problems were surmountable. I think the real problem here has to do with Trump's personality and the fact that he had to brag that he settled the India-Pakistan crisis and that he deserved a Nobel Prize and that he was greatly appreciative of Pakistan for nominating him for a Nobel Prize and hoped that India would do the same. Those sorts of things started to poison the relationship between India and the United States in the spring. And then you have the geopolitical issue of India importing Russian oil, really complicating matters. But I don't see domestic politics as an issue here.
Okay, Professor Mearsheimer, just a couple of more questions here, sir. Do you think that the Trump administration miscalculated India's response? Because India so far has chosen not to respond to the belligerence of the United States. There is caution, there is measure in which India has responded.
I think there's no question he miscalculated. It was a huge mistake on his part. He's now created a world in which we, the United States, have pushed the Russians into the arms of the Chinese, and we're now pushing the Indians into the arms of the Chinese. This is not in America's strategic interest. America should have good relations with Russia, in fact, very good relations with Russia, and America should have very good relations with India. The fact that we don't, and the fact that Trump has greatly contributed to this situation, just shows you that he really doesn't know what he's doing.
Okay, is there a window of negotiation open here? Is there a possibility of some kind of resolution of this crisis?
Well, I think it largely depends on the United States and, in particular, President Trump. And the question you have to ask yourself is President Trump going to realize that he's made a huge blunder here? As you pointed out, I think quite correctly, there's no evidence that India is going to back off. And given that India is not going to back off, and it's not in our interest to see Modi, Xi, and Putin all smiling and shaking hands together, one would surmise that Trump is going to reverse direction and he's going to try to improve relations with India. There have been all sorts of reports here in the United States that President Trump has been trying to call Prime Minister Modi, but he can't get through to Prime Minister Modi. That indicates to me that maybe Trump wants to bury the hatchet, as we say, and restore good relations. I can't say that for certain, but maybe he's trying to do that. I would be surprised if he doesn't try to do that at some point in the near future, because again, it's in our strategic interest. But if he does that, the question then becomes, how will India react? And my sense is that the Indians will not go to great lengths to restore close relations with the United States. I think India now understands that you have to be very careful when you're dealing with the United States, especially when you're dealing with President Trump, and you don't want to get too close to the United States. You don't want to be too dependent on the United States. So my view is that even if President Trump reaches out to Prime Minister Modi, I think Prime Minister Modi, for smart reasons, will keep his distance.
All right, Professor John Mearsheimer, really appreciate your time. Thank you for speaking to India Today.